Mm-hmm. Okay, everybody ready? I'm letting people in. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Maya Chalovic, and I will be your host for today's event entitled Regulation and Self-Regulation of Social Media. This event is part of a series called Looking Ahead, organized by Media Center Sarajevo and partner media development organizations from the region who are working on a project called Media for Citizens, Citizens for Media. And the series is aiming to address some of the trends and issues we in the media literacy community face today. So far, we have discussed best practices in developing media literacy programs by the Guardian Foundation, as well as a phenomenon called revenge pornography, which has been hitting the region significantly during the pandemic. You can find the recordings of both events on our YouTube channel. Today, we will be focusing on the complex issue of content moderation and regulation of social media, on all the ways social networking sites and other online services we use every day decide what can be posted and said on their platforms, what stays, what goes, and how these decisions impact various aspects of our life and work. Our speaker today is Gillian York, Director of International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a founding member of Deep Lab, and author of a new book called Silicon Values, the Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. After Gillian's presentation, we will have time for discussion, so please feel free to leave comments and questions in chat and Q&A. We have 3 interpretation channels today: Albanian, Macedonian, and Bosnian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Croatian. You can choose the channel you want to follow below. And you can write us questions in English and also in any of these languages. Our interpreters will translate them for us. So without further ado, Gillian, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya, for the lovely introduction and for having me today. It's really wonderful to get to speak to one of my favorite parts of the world. So thank you for coming. First, I will just give a brief introduction about myself, my perspective and where I'm coming from, so that you know that we all have biases, and I would like you to know mine. So my name is Gillian York, and for the past 10 years, I've been at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is an organization in the United States, although I'm in Germany, based on fighting for digital rights, rights online. We work on a number of different issues, including copyright and intellectual property, freedom of expression, privacy, and building privacy-enhancing technologies. But my specific focus right now is on the global impact that social media companies have in the ways that they regulate speech, both on their own terms and in response to regulation and government requests. So I'll be looking at that today. And I've also written this book recently, and this gets into the background of this issue, specifically from around 2007 until now. So I'm going to talk about some of that today and try to provide a couple of cases to help you understand where I'm coming from and how both regulation and self-regulation impacts people all over the world. So I came to this issue because I lived in Morocco from about 2005 to 2007, which is where I first encountered internet censorship. Back then, it was the government blocking websites, but within a few years, I became aware of the fact that governments were placing demands on social media companies to hand over information about their users, such as we saw in China and some other places, but also to take down speech and sometimes, really important speech, such as speech criticizing government or advocating around educational issues, etc. So really, I guess the perspective that I want to share today is one that this is a very complex issue. There aren't any easy answers, but there is a lot that we can do, both as citizens, but also, there's a lot that we can push our legislators and these companies to do. So without further ado, I'll jump into the presentation. There. Oh, sorry. Okay. Sensitive keyboard. So this is just a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the existing regulatory environments for social media platforms. Now, most of the platforms that I'm going to talk about are the ones that are from the United States originally, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. There are obviously other social media platforms throughout the world. There's quite a few coming from China these days, and those are subject to different laws and regulations. But because most of the platforms that we use every day have their origins in the United States, at least, it's really important to understand why or how US regulations work and kind of why they have so much control over the rest of the world. I'll also talk about self-regulation, content moderation. We'll get into that in depth, and other efforts that companies are working on to police content or to, minimize harms online. We'll get a little bit into the history of these platforms, 2011 roughly until now, and how things progressed and got to the state that we're in at the moment. We'll look at some of the challenges that we're facing around harassment, extremism, hate speech, and disinformation. And really, I'm going to try to end this by talking about finding a balance between regulation and self-regulation. And so again, I'm coming from the perspective that there are no easy answers. I'm concerned both about free expression and about harms online. And I think that we have to take both of those things into account as we look toward solutions. So, one other thing before I move to the next slide. I also just want to start with the differentiation between social media, which I see as platforms which host user-generated content or speech, really, and other types of tech companies, such as those that provide infrastructure, like internet service providers or Amazon Web Services, things like that. So today I'm going to be talking about social media, although I'm happy to answer questions about infrastructure providers at the end of the talk. So first, I'm going to start with the regulatory environment in the United States, just to give some background. So there's a lot of discussion right now in the US and globally about something called Section 230. There's also a lot of misinformation around what Section 230 is and how it affects platforms. So we'll start with the First Amendment. I think most people will have heard the term before, but the First Amendment, basically, of the US Constitution limits the ability of government, the US government, to restrict speech. There are some exceptions, but more or less in the US, there's a kind of absolute idea of free expression. But it also limits the ability of government to tell companies what to do. And so basically, the way that you can look at this is that in the US, companies are treated like people. And so it's kind of counterintuitive coming from another part of the world. Why is it that the First Amendment would guarantee the companies a right to censor people? But in the US, the concept of censorship is really limited to what the government does. Now, I personally disagree with this. I see censorship as something that authorities do, but for legal purposes, censorship is something that the government does. But because the First Amendment also allows platforms to curate their sites as they want to, we can think of platforms as being more like more like a museum or a television channel than the government, in the sense that they're allowed to say, hey, we don't want you to post pictures of dogs. And that would be perfectly legal within this context. But what this means is that it's altered the importance of the First Amendment in protecting speech rights. And instead, with our increasingly online lives, the regulation of speech has largely fallen to private actors. So again, the companies that we're talking about today. Now, there's this other law that I mentioned, Section 230. I won't get too deep into the history, but basically this law came about in 1996 when the Clinton administration in the US tried to create something called the Communications Decency Act, which was meant to regulate obscene content, things like online pornography. The Communications Decency Act was eventually shut down. It did not, it was passed, but it was revoked. But this one piece of it, Section 230 of it, remained intact. And this is a really important law. What it does is it protects companies from liability, both in terms of what they choose to moderate. So if a company chooses to remove all pictures of dogs or all pictures of cats from its platform, they're protected from liability for that. But it also protects companies if they don't take down certain types of speech. And that's really just anything that's not illegal. So in the US, because we have so few restrictions in terms of illegal speech, this means that companies are basically not liable in any way. They're not penalized for not taking down certain content. This means that hate speech has been legally allowed to flourish on these platforms for a long time. Of course, there are other things as well, but I think just in terms of giving the basic framework, this is what things look like in the US. Now, of course, this impacts the rest of the world because the way that these platforms moderate, they're moderating speech from all over the place. But let's get into that just a little bit, and then I'll come back to the regulations. So like I said, these existing legal frameworks in the US give companies a lot of power in terms of what they can have on their platforms. So the companies get to make the decisions. There have been a lot of pushes from civil society over the years, both in the US and abroad, for better policies, increased transparency, various other measures. But lately, there's been more of a push towards regulation. And these tech platforms, as they've grown and become increasingly global, they've kind of struggled to respond to new threats. So I'm going to give a bit of that history as well. So first, let's just go into what is content moderation. Now, content moderation is the way in which platforms police or regulate what's on the platform, or what they host, basically. So there's kind of two primary methods here to moderate content. One of these is something that I think all of you will be familiar with, and this is called flagging or reporting. And this is what happens when you see something that you don't like on a platform, or which you think violates the rules, and you click a button that flags it or makes the company aware of that speech, and then a human, usually a person on the other end, looks at that speech and says, okay, this is against the rules or it's not against the rules. And then there's another thing that's used, which is proactive detection. And this is happening more and more, especially during the pandemic. And this is where platforms use automation to locate things and maybe decide whether they're against the rules or send them to a human moderator to make decisions about them. Most of the platforms that we use every day are using some combination of these two things. So for example, when it comes to things that are deemed to be international terrorism groups by the United States, those are usually, that kind of stuff is usually detected by automation. And the reason behind this is primarily so that human moderators don't have to look at really terrible things. This is also true when it comes to things like child sexual abuse imagery, and increasingly things like revenge porn, which Maya mentioned in the introduction. This is something where automation is used quite a bit. And again, it's mostly for the purpose of protecting the human moderators, but also because it's less expensive than paying people to look at that stuff. Now, flagging, as I mentioned, is when a user reports content to a platform. The content's reviewed either by the human or by an automated process, and the decision is made about the content. Now, historically, that decision was binary. Either the content is left up or it's taken down. And this is what we're mostly familiar with. But in recent years, companies have found new ways to moderate content that's not a simple binary decision. This includes things like demonetizing, which is really common on YouTube, giving users warnings or temporary bans. We see this a lot with Facebook. They'll lock your account for 24 hours for the first violation, maybe longer for the next one, and so on and so forth. And there are also a number of other measures that companies take, such as punishing users with strikes or other things. This is just an example from Facebook of what it looks like when you report something. So, Facebook creates all of its own rules around all of these different categories, which you can find on their community standards page. I'll get more into that in a minute. But this is basically just what it looks like when you go to report somebody. This is from today, so this is a very recent screenshot. And basically for most users, this is what they'll see. And you can choose the category and then answer some other questions to report the content to the platform. So things have really changed over the years, and I want to just give a little bit of that picture to understand where we were a decade ago when I first started working on this and where we are now. When most platforms that are popular today launched around 15 years ago, the mid-aughts, mid-2000s, they did so with a very minimal set of rules. So when you first joined Facebook, there weren't that many rules at all. There are a couple things that are still true today, like no nudity and you can't use fake names. But for the most part, a lot of things were allowed. And that's the framework that these companies started with. They were really aimed at, free expression to some degree, but I think it was also just because these platforms were really intended for a much smaller purpose in the beginning. They didn't see themselves as these global networks that they've since become. Now, also in the beginning, these platforms only had terms of service. Now, everybody's heard of terms of service, but I think most of us don't usually read them. They're often written in very legal terminology and difficult to understand. Later, these companies faced pressure to create rules that users could actually understand, and that's where community standards or community guidelines came from. So today, when you look for the rules on most of these platforms, you'll find a set of terms of service that are still there, the thing that you sign when you first sign up to a platform or register for it. But then there's also a set of rules that are written in very easy, simple language that are meant for you to be able to understand. One thing to note about Facebook, this is kind of interesting. Facebook launched in 2004 or 5. It became available to the rest of the world in 2007, but they didn't actually provide community standards until 2011. So in the early years, when people were using Facebook, they would often be kicked off the platform without even really understanding what the rules were. And so we can see how much that's changed over the years. Now there's a very complex list of rules, and that's true for most of the platforms that we'll talk about. So I think it's important to understand the history, to understand how we've gotten to the place that we are now. I joined Facebook in, I think, 2005. It was only open to US university students and graduates at the time. And like I said, it didn't have a lot of rules, and it was very limited in terms of who could participate. And then it started to grow, but still in 2007, when it opened to the entire world, there were most places in the world didn't have very high internet access rates. And so it was still a small number of people compared to the, more than, I think we're at 2 billion now, people using Facebook. And this is true, of course, of YouTube, of Twitter, et cetera. And so in 2011, I think before 2011, social media was seen as a largely positive phenomenon. It allowed us to connect with other people, allowed us to make friends all over the world, to learn things that were happening in other places that we might not otherwise see through our country's media. And for me, it was a really, really positive experience. Living in another country, I was able to connect with people back home for much cheaper than picking up the phone. But I was also able to network with other people and learn from them. And in 2011, when the uprising began in Tunisia and then in Egypt, and we saw lots of protests happening all over the world, the media at the time talked about social media as this very positive phenomenon that allowed people to challenge power and create social change. Now, from my perspective, and I talk about this a lot in my book, this really changed, this kind of shifted rapidly. Between 2012 and 2014, we saw a few things happen. And by 2014, I think the world had sort of changed, and so had the use of social media. So by 2014, this narrative really shifted as we saw kind of three things happen. One was the rise of global terrorism, specifically the Islamic State or ISIS. Another was the rise of the alt-right in the US and right-wing populism in other parts of the world. And then the third was increasing harassment across platforms. Now, all of these things had always existed in our societies, but as platforms grew and more people came online and began to use these platforms, one of the things that I witnessed was that the tactics that activists had developed on social media began to be used for harmful purposes. So let me give one example about this. In, I think, 2010 or so, there were some really interesting things happening where people were organizing protests on smaller platforms like Reddit and then taking them to platforms like Twitter. So there was this quiet organization happening that would then be used for a really kind of burst of movement on Twitter or on Facebook. Within a couple of years, I saw that same tactic that had been used in places like Tunisia and Egypt, being used by harassment networks. So you'd see people grouped together on websites like 4chan or Reddit to organize mob harassment tactics that they would then take to places like Twitter and use to attack someone. And this has become, more and more sophisticated over the years. But I think for me, 2014 is really the year where all of this kind of blew up and the narrative shifted to talk more about how we could regulate these platforms and what we need them to do. And so the way that I see it now is that we've got a number of different challenges that came from that time. And I'm going to talk more specifically about those things. But I just want to start with a couple of key premises. One is that the same tools used by those organizing for social and political change can also be used by bad actors. So I think that this is really important because whenever we talk about regulation or self-regulation, it's important to understand the nuance. And in the US right now, I see it as kind of this conversation is happening on one side where people are talking about, we need to regulate platforms, we need them to take this down. But at the same time, these platforms have also been really important for freedom of expression, for organizing, for social and political change. And so it's important to view that in both of those lights. I would also note that it's really important to understand that these companies are not only under regulatory demand by the United States and Europe, which is what most of the media coverage is these days, but also that governments all over the world, many of whom do not respect human rights, are putting increasing demands on platforms. I want to talk in detail about a couple of those, but I do just want to put that in historical perspective for a moment to say that this has been happening since pretty much the beginning of these platforms. Around 2007, we saw YouTube become one of the first platforms to comply with demands from less democratic governments. Specifically, Turkey and Thailand back then were demanding that YouTube take down specific videos, or if they didn't do that, then those governments would block YouTube. And so YouTube was put in this really interesting position where they had to decide, okay, is it worth it for us to get blocked in this country? Or should we find a way to comply with these demands? And what they ended up doing is something that still happens to today, which is they decided to remove the videos just in those specific countries. And this is something that we see companies doing even now. I didn't put slides on it, but I'm happy to show a screen at the end of my talk. There's been an increasing effort over the years for these companies to be more transparent about those takedowns. And so most of these companies, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Apple, Twitch, all of them really, with a few exceptions, publish transparency reports that actually show what various governments around the world are asking of them. And so if you look at one of these transparency reports, they're all available online. You can actually see what your government is asking of these companies to do and understand to what degree the companies are complying with those requests or demands. And finally, I just want to note that I think these social ills have to be addressed with nuance, and we can't simply solve them with technology. And we'll talk about that a lot more as well. Just keeping time on myself. Okay, so I want to just argue what the case for regulation is, and then we'll talk what the case for self-regulation is and where we can find some balance there. So right now, there's a lot of pressure and effort in the US, at the European Union level, and elsewhere in the world to push for regulation that would make companies liable for the speech that they host. Now, this is really tricky because in the US, it's very tricky because of the fact that these companies are protected by the First Amendment. Elsewhere, it's tricky because a lot of the efforts that are being placed or being pushed on these companies, especially in less democratic countries, are going to have the effect of creating an uneven environment for people around the world. So just as social media and the internet in general have enabled people all over the world to have greater access to information and freedom of expression, some of the efforts that we're seeing from governments like Turkey's and India's and Brazil's are meant to push companies to restrict speech that is illegal in those countries. But a lot of times the laws are not in line with freedom of expression and human rights. So for instance, in Turkey, some of the laws that we're seeing or that are being pushed upon companies are things like requiring them to take down speech that's critical of government or even of some of the history of the country. And so again, this creates an uneven media environment for the world. In the US, most of the effort is aimed at stripping companies of their liability protections and imposing penalties when companies host certain harmful content. Like I said, this is tricky because the Constitution does protect the majority of speech. But in 2008, we saw the first cracks, so to speak, in Section 230 come with the creation of a law called Sesta Fosta. Now, this law was intended to stop sex trafficking, but let me try to explain this. Basically, it's had unintended consequences for some users. And the reason for this is quite clear. Basically, the way that the law was created, it was done without much civil society consultation. And it's really kind of a blunt object that seeks to get rid of a wide variety of speech around sexual content, not just sex trafficking itself. Now, the issue here is that because the companies will be held financially liable, potentially for hosting any unlawful content, oftentimes what we see happen is that the lawyers that work for these companies, the counsel, they push stricter rules on users in order to make sure that they won't be held liable. And so this has what's called a chilling effect on speech. And this is really the concern that I have and that a lot of civil society activists have about some of these liability efforts. And really, this is because we've seen this happen in a number of different areas. I won't get into too much detail around them. I think Sesta Fosta is a really good example, but if you're interested, a couple of areas to look at are around US sanctions law and some of the rules in Germany, which I'll talk about as well. Sorry, let me move on. So like I said, there are regulatory efforts in a number of countries to impose financial and other penalties on companies. And a lot of these work by forcing companies to remove content within a certain time frame. In Germany, we have a law called the Network Enforcement Act, or NetzDG, which pushes companies to remove illegal speech within 24 hours. And so this creates a disincentive for companies to allow a broad range of speech, and it has resulted in over removal of certain content that the platforms or that the content moderators think falls within that category. And then there's kind of another set of regulatory efforts that I actually like a lot more, such as the Digital Services Act in Europe. One of the best parts of the Digital Services Act is that it would require companies to act with greater transparency and accountability toward users. Like I said, these companies are already publishing transparency reports, but they're still limited in what they contain. Most of the transparency reporting is focused on government demands, but there's not a lot when it comes to what the platforms actually take down within their own frameworks. And so one of the things that civil society has been pushing for is for companies to publish things like their error rates. And that means how many mistakes do they make when they're moderating content. There's reports that suggest that Facebook's error rate is maybe 10%. We believe that it's actually higher. So of all the content that they moderate under their own rules, that 10% of the decisions that they make are mistakes. Knowing that information would help users make informed decisions about what they post and help them to understand which platforms they would want to use. So like I said, there's case for regulation, case for self-regulation, and I really believe that there's no easy answers here and that we have to find a balance between the two. So many of the existing regulatory efforts, like I said, I believe that they would create an uneven playing field on what are essentially international platforms. So this has been called, unfortunately, the balkanization of the internet. A better word for it, I think, is the fracturing of the internet, or I like this one, the splinternet. And basically what this would mean is, in addition to the government restrictions that we already see, lots of governments around the world block websites, we would also see increasing demands, or we are seeing increasing demands on companies to remove content. And this means that you might see something completely different than what I'm seeing online. And so for me, I see this as a setback from the environment that we've had for the past 20 or so years. I also strongly believe that some of the regulatory efforts underway in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere threaten freedom of expression. But at the same time, I think it's also very important for us to acknowledge the ways in which harassment and hateful speech and other harmful things online, harmful forms of expression, can also have a chilling effect on free speech. So, for example, if you're a person, a woman perhaps, who is very active online, you're probably bound to experience quite a bit of harassment, and as such, that will have a sorry, that will have a chilling effect on the freedom of expression that you're able to experience. And sorry, I saw something in the chat. I just want to clarify. I do not use the term balkanization of the internet. It is a term that has been used in the critique of this phenomenon for a long time, but I prefer the term splinternet, and I think we should get away from using that terminology because it's wrong. I just think it's important to note because it has been used for many years by Western commentators. Finally, the current civil society efforts toward self-regulation are focused on a handful of things, including transparency, accountability, due process, so that's appeals, making sure that users have the right to appeal decisions made by companies, and better tools that could be put in the hands of users to help them moderate their own spaces online. We've seen, in the early days of these platforms, you couldn't block other users. You didn't have the ability to curate your own feed. And even today, a lot of what we're shown is based on decisions made by algorithms, automation. If we put better tools in the hands of users to moderate their own spaces, or to decide together, such as with Reddit has a very different system that allows users to vote content up or down. That would enable users to create a better online environment for themselves. And finally, there's a growing focus on ensuring that universal human rights frameworks are utilized to guide regulation and self-regulatory practices. And I believe that this is incredibly important. I think that if we look away from the US form of regulation and toward the ways in which universal human rights put forth, the way that universal human rights frameworks can be utilized, we would see that there is a balance between expression and safety and other important rights. And so freedom of expression is very important, but it's not the only right that's important for us online. And so, how do we find that balance? So here's what I believe, but I'd love to have this discussion with anyone. I think that the status quo can't work. Right now, we're seeing companies remove critical speech while also allowing things like disinformation, harassment, and hate to thrive. But I also believe that a binary approach isn't the solution, and that any efforts to rein in platform power need to take into account freedom of expression as well. So again, we have to find a balance between the rights to safety and security and the right to free speech. I think that transparency, accountability, and appeals are really important, and I'm going to talk about one key effort briefly after this that I'm working on. But I also think that we have to think about the business model and the platform architecture. So right now, the way that platforms are designed is often about increasing profit for them rather than about creating a good user experience. And so it's really important to look from the ground up in the models, the design models of these platforms, to find ways that they can be useful for all users and not just a single set of users. And in order to get there, of course, we have to make sure that a wide variety of people from all over the world are included in these design processes, as well as in policymaking processes. And my book talks about this a lot, but that's not what's happening. Right now, most of these companies have a very a very American approach to creating their policies and in designing their platforms. And people from all over the world, and particularly the global South, are not brought into these processes often, if at all, then until the very end. And this is something that I believe has to change and could change right now if there was the will to do it. And finally, I think that we do have to look toward non-technical solutions. I don't believe in techno-solutionism. I think that in order to address these problems, of course, there are technical things we can do, but if we don't address the underlying societal issues, we're not going to see these things change. Come back to that slide so I can just keep on that thread, and then I'll talk about that other effort at the very end. So I think that there's a number of different things that governments and people can do right now that don't rely on the tech companies or techno solutions to solve them. Media literacy, which is what this whole program is about, is one of those key areas. When we talk about disinformation, for example, or misinformation, there's a lot of effort at the moment, especially in the US, that really is kind of looking at these platforms as being the main spreader of misinformation. But if we look towards the history of media, whether it's print media or broadcast media, we've seen the spread of disinformation for a long time. So when I talk about this in the US, I often talk about the misinformation that I was taught in school around the world and world history. And I'm sure that we've all experienced that no matter what country that we're from. When I talk about US media, I think about the ways in which the US reports on the rest of the world and how unbalanced that often is. And so we can't just blame the platforms for creating this. Of course, algorithms and the kind of hands-off approach that these platforms have had to the spread of disinformation has exacerbated the problem, but it didn't create it. And I think that that's really important for us to note. And so therefore, to me, one of the biggest solutions to this is media literacy training from the very beginning in schools that teaches critical thinking and an approach to the media that is not the way that I was taught, basically, which is to accept things, to not challenge them, etc. I also think that better training of law enforcement and judges to enforce existing laws. So when it comes to harassment, this is a really interesting problem for me because in the US, as in most places in the world, harassment is not considered legal speech. And yet the platforms take a hands-off approach to moderating it. But often when people turn to law enforcement, and I know this to be true in most regions as well, law enforcement often puts their hands up and says that it's not their problem either. And so if you're dealing with harassment online, you often have very few solutions other than, say, blocking someone. And that's not a very sufficient solution. And so yes, on the one hand, we should be looking to platforms to find ways of moderating harassment. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that before harassment turns to violence, that we have ways of affecting it in our societies as well. And so that, for me, it comes to better training of law enforcement and judges, as well as, of course, education and stopping hate and harassment before it starts. There's also a lot of efforts, which I'm sure you're familiar with, around reducing screen time. And I think that this is another important thing as well. But especially during the pandemic, I'm a bit wary of this approach. And the reason for that is, it's become, I assume that this is true for many of you as well, but it's become very clear to me how reliant we are on not just social media, but on the internet as a whole. Many of us right now are reliant on the internet to do our jobs. I know here we're under a pretty extreme lockdown. I can't really do much outside. And so I rely on the internet to get my groceries, to access basic services. And so that's another really important part of all of this. We can't simply rely on any one solution. We also have to recognize the role that the internet is playing in our lives right now and will continue to. And finally, I think that we have to consider how globalized these platforms have become, and that a lot of the regulatory ideas, as I mentioned before, if they don't take into account universal human rights, then we are going to see a much more fractured internet, one where people's access to information is imbalanced. And for me, this really plays into existing global inequality. I want to give just one example. This is a little out there as an example, but I think it's a really important one. The United States has economic sanctions on a number of different countries. And as a result of this, there are places where people are not even able to use some of these free tools because the US places laws on those countries. And so what this has done is there are places in the world where you can't even access, the wide variety of ebooks that most of us can because of a bad US regulation that bans people in another part of the world from doing so. If you take something like that and you add on to that other penalties for these platforms, I think that we're going to see really a decrease in access to information that could be incredibly troubling in a global environment where we're all competing for the same jobs, where we're moving around a lot. And so that's why, for me, it's very important that any regulatory frameworks take into account a universal human rights framework. I want to just go back to that other slide, and I think I'm running out of time. Yeah. This is one effort that I just wanted to share. It's something that I'm really proud of that we've been working on with a global group of organizations. In 2018, we created the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability in Content Moderation. And these are really just focused on three basic areas. We want companies to publish transparency reports. I mentioned that earlier, but the website santaclaraprinciples.org gets into the details of this, but basically we want them to publish numbers, things like their error rates, to demonstrate what they're actually removing. The second one is notice. One thing that a lot of users experience on these platforms, when they violate the rules, they often don't receive clear messaging as to what they did wrong. And so that's why it's really important that companies are clear with users and provide them with sufficient notice. And then the third one, appeals. I talked about that a lot, so I don't need to repeat it. But the reason that I bring up this effort is because in 2018, we actually wrote an open letter to Facebook that was signed by 108 organizations in more than 30 countries. We all agreed and sent this letter to Facebook demanding that they take these principles into account. Now, Facebook has not done that entirely, but what we've seen since then, they did create a full appeals process, and we've seen a number of companies endorse these principles. So for the past year, a bunch of these organizations, again, in multiple countries, we've been working together to revisit these principles and to look at what else is needed. And so that's where I just want to invite you, if you have any thoughts on that, you're welcome to share them with me outside of the talk. But really, some of the things that we've heard from groups around the world were really important in this process. One of them was around language. And so I just wanted to mention that because I think that for many of you, this will be an issue. A lot of these companies do not employ sufficient numbers of people to moderate content in local languages. And a lot of the decisions that they make around who they do employ and what languages they focus on are based on economics. And so it is economically important for them to moderate content well in Germany and in Turkey, for example. Those are two very big e-commerce markets. But of course, I think for a lot of the countries that you're in, and for the vast majority of the world's countries, it's just not that economically important to these companies to make sure that they're doing a good job of moderating content. And so I just wanted to share that that's one of the things that we're going to be pushing companies to do, is to be transparent about those numbers so that groups all over the world can advocate better for their needs. Yeah, so I think that was my last slide. There we go. Yes, thank you. So I'm going to stop there because I think that a lot of interesting questions will come up, and I want to make sure that I do clarify anything that that you want to ask about. So thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. That was very interesting. And let's see if we have any questions from the audience. You can write questions in chat or Q&A. You can write them in English or Albanian, Macedonian, or BCSM, and the translators will translate the questions. Somebody is.
Yeah.
So we have a question. What finding balance should ask for? Having a new social contract between users and platforms. Would you share some of the teaching tactics on deep materiality of black box society? We have a question from Mario, and okay. Well, if you want to take that one, Gillian, and there's other questions coming in.
I'm not sure that I understand that one. I'm sorry.
Do you care to explain further, Mario? We have another question while Mario gives us more detail about what he actually meant by this. Anita says, thank you, that was really great. I have a couple of questions. First, social media have been introducing new rules against the spread of conspiracy theories and disinformation on COVID-19, but have been criticized that these are not efficient. What is your opinion on that?
Sure. So this is where I get to talk a little bit more about my opinion, which I'm much better at talking about, frankly. So social media platforms have a really hard problem in front of them when it comes to misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories. So I want to talk about, I'll use the example of vaccines and medical misinformation just to explain how difficult this problem is and why I think the measures are not efficient. So when it comes to medical misinformation, you've got two problems. One is, of course, that people spreading misinformation about things like vaccines or about the virus itself, COVID-19, but as well as any kind of medical misinformation, obviously can have a really harmful impact on society. And so there's a lot of demand that these companies do something about that. I think that that's right. At the same time, I think it's also important for us to note that historically, there are plenty of medical issues that medicine has been wrong about. So let me find one. I mean, one good example of this, I think that people might be familiar with, is MCE. Sorry, I always get the acronym wrong. The illness that was formerly known as chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is something where over the past decade, we've seen people with this illness advocating for themselves and advocating against the medical industry, and they've successfully shifted medical practice around this particular illness. And so this is why it's a difficult problem, because on the one hand, you want people to be able to connect with each other around medical issues and share information that might help get to a better diagnosis. And I think that a lot of the global conversation around some things like that, like autism, has gotten us to a better place. And yet at the same time, disinformation, conspiracy theories can be so harmful. And so what these companies have done is two things. One, I think, is a good one. The other one, I'm a little more critical of. On the one hand, they've employed fact checkers, and this is true of political disinformation as well. They've employed fact checkers to correct misinformation and share correct information about things. And I think that this is a good approach, especially when a variety of fact checkers are employed. And yet at the same time, there's been some problems with that, as we've seen with like the employing of the Daily Caller, which is a right-wing news site, to do some of that fact checking. And so it's very important that they ensure that the sources, the people that are doing that fact checking, are getting things right. Another thing that they've done has been a little bit more blunt, and I've actually seen it result in some negative impact. And this is the kind of automated correction of information. So when you go on Instagram, for example, if somebody's talking about the vaccine, Instagram will just slap this big label over it that points you to, if you're in the US, it points you to the CDC. If you're elsewhere, I think it points you to the WHO or maybe your local health authority. But this one is actually sometimes not so good, because it can actually be applied to positive information as well. And I've seen this labeling kind of go on top of really key information about the vaccine. So I think, yeah, my opinion is basically that they're not doing enough. They could do a lot more. And really the reason that they're not is because that would require them to invest more in people. And really these companies don't have much of a financial incentive to invest well in content moderation. And that's, I think, why we're seeing this problem.
We have another question. Do you think the internet platforms will eventually upgrade terms and conditions? Hate speech is widespread among everyone, especially now during the COVID crisis when everyone is online. Is there something about the internet etiquette that needs to be changed?
Yeah, so I didn't talk much about this because I think people probably already know it, but I'll share it as my opinion. Hate speech is a really hard problem to define. It's hard enough in one society, but when you apply it globally, it is really complicated. So on the one hand, you have hate speech, which is a sort of amorphous or broad concept. And then you have incitement, which is a legal concept with a clear path, incitement to violence, right? Oftentimes when we talk about hate speech, we're talking about both of those things. And I think it's really important to separate them and to talk about incitement that passes an actual test for incitement. Your country may have its own test, the US has its own test, but there's also an international three-part test for determining what is or is not likely to cause actual real-world violence. And then, of course, there's hate speech, again, which is this very broad concept. And I think the reason that we're seeing so many different governments create different laws and regulatory frameworks and strategies for combating hate speech is because we as a society, or as a global society, have never quite agreed on what is hate speech. So I live in Germany, where a lot of the things that are illegal stem from the harms of World War II and the genocide, the Holocaust. And so in Germany, it's considered perfectly reasonable to restrict the ability to share symbols like Nazi symbols or denial of the Holocaust. And I understand that because this country has a different history than my country. In the US, though, it's really interesting because the inability to address hate speech results in a lot of that stuff just kind of being erased from discussion, erased from history. And yet at the same time, hate speech laws and rules on these platforms are also applied too broadly. So we saw, for example, activists in the Black Lives Matter movement having their content removed from these platforms. We see people who are talking back against harassment. Sometimes they get cut off from the platforms because they use bad words. I saw this happen to someone yesterday. They used the F word in English and they were erased from the platform because they were said to be engaged in bullying. And so this for me is really a problem that happens when you try to apply automation to a complex problem. That's why it's really important that if we're going to regulate hate speech, that we do it in a way that captures that nuance and that really invests in the right resources. Because if we don't do that, then we're just going to see more and more legitimate speech be removed.
Yes, that is, oh, there you go. We have the explanation from Maria. So yeah, I wanted to talk more about this automation in different languages, how this is going to work, and whether that's something that's going to produce even more mistakes. But first, we have Mario's question. He says, okay, as I understand, social contract has been broken. So it is, which would ask for having, or at least imagining, a new one between citizens, users, and corporate platforms. About the second question, he says that media literacy rarely tackles exploitation of users' data and so-called platform society. What would be your take on imposing a critique of surveillance capitalism more openly, I guess, in these media literacy efforts?
Yeah. So I didn't talk much about surveillance capitalism. I was just looking for the quote to define it properly as defined by Shoshana Zuboff. But basically, surveillance capitalism is, I think, just so we're all on the same page, is the way in which these companies gain profit. They gain profit by sweeping up all of our data and guiding us to buy more things through advertising. That's really their business model. And so I see surveillance capitalism as the overarching framework within which these companies exist. That's why my book has the tag, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. And so I do think that that's a really, really key part of media literacy, to understand what these platforms are there for. Facebook and Twitter and all of them really kind of sold themselves to us as being ways to make the world more open and connected, to use Facebook's early tagline, or to be able to engage in activism. And in their early years, they they actually did a lot to make us believe that that's why they were here. And that's why I think it's really important for us to understand that their primary motivator is profit, and everything that we're sharing on these platforms helps them make more money. And so if we view it within that lens, I mean, yes, we can still use these platforms. I do use them. And yet at the same time, I'm much more careful now about what I share and what I expect. And, you know, I think a few years ago, I still do, I get a lot of emails from people who claim that they're being censored by these platforms. And I do believe on, you know, from a philosophical level that it's censorship. And yet there's a great misunderstanding by a lot of users around the world about the fact that these platforms have no obligations in terms of free expression. And so to go to the first part of the question around a social contract, I'm not in favor of most of the regulatory ideas being put forward because of the concerns that I raised earlier. And yet I do see a need for a new social contract between platforms and users. I'm only in the beginning stages of thinking about how we get there. I think the how is much more difficult than the what. But for me, you know, users need to be brought into the process. And so we're seeing things now like the Facebook Oversight Board, which I wanted to talk more about and forgot to put it in my slides. So, but the Facebook Oversight Board, for example, is one method. I think it's a very imperfect one, but it was created as a way to have external judgments on Facebook's decisions. And so the reason I don't like it is because it's a little oversimplified, and the mandate does not allow decisions that are made by the oversight board to have an impact on future decisions. But at the same time, we're seeing the members of that oversight board shift its purpose, and they're starting to make policy recommendations to Facebook, and they've already shifted the mandate of what the oversight board does. So at first it was there just to look at decisions that were made around takedowns. Now it's also there to look at decisions being made around what are called leave ups, or things that the companies did not take down that perhaps they should have. But I think that it's not enough, and we do have to think about ways to bring people directly into the process. And so I'd like to see more effort focused on that instead of ways to make companies liable for what people say. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. I mean, we have a lot of our guests today, attendees, are members of civil society organizations and journalists, and we have several questions about the specific ways that these platforms treat certain kinds of audiences. A question we have from somebody following on Facebook through our stream is kind of going to what you talked about earlier about Santa Clara principles and civil society's efforts to kind of influence the regulation of social media. The question is, what would you say was the greatest win of the civil society so far in getting the social media platforms to listen to their concerns, and what might be the actual channels to reach these platforms by civil society? Our audience member is saying, how big do you need to be for them to listen to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also want to make sure to answer your question about automation if we have time. So to this question, I mean, I think probably the greatest win that I've seen, and this is obviously from my own perspective, but also just in terms of global impact, is the original push to get companies to publish transparency reports. That came from civil society. It wasn't the company's ideas, nor is there any legal obligation for them to do so. It started around 2009, I believe, after Yahoo, remember Yahoo? After Yahoo handed over information about a user in China to the Chinese government that resulted in that person being arrested and imprisoned for more than 10 years. And so after that, there was a strong push by civil society, which was much smaller at the time, to push companies to publish these transparency reports. And it started with Google. And by 2014, I think almost all of the companies were doing it. And now they've expanded their transparency reporting, often in response to civil society. I think if you're a smaller civil society organization, and especially one outside of the US, because really these companies seem to only care sometimes about what US organizations have to say, unfortunately. I think it's really important to get networked with other orgs, whether they're in Europe or the US. because of just the way that it works, a lot of these companies just, they don't want to do the work that's required to understand who they need to listen to. But one of the things that I've been doing that I work really hard to do is bring smaller organizations into that discussion. So like when we did the Santa Clara Principles letter and when we did this open process, a lot of that was to make sure that global, like not just Global South, but that organizations outside of the US and Europe were being heard. And so we've also brought folks to like helped fund folks to come to conferences, not my organization, but like the people that I work with. And I also run a global coalition that any civil society organization can join. So if that's interesting to you, if you're from civil society and you're not part of that, just let me know. I'm easy to find on the internet. And I'm happy to join you, bring you into that. We have like monthly calls where we all get together and discuss different activism campaigns that we can do, or we just learn from each other and about what are happening in other or what is happening in other countries. And so I think that that's, I don't know that it's necessarily that you have to be loud. I think that it's just really important to stand in solidarity. And I think that's more important for us, the bigger organizations in the US, that we have to stand in solidarity with organizations in the rest of the world and work together, because that's the only way that these companies will listen to us.
Thank you. As I said, a lot of the members of our audience today are journalists working for media organizations, and we have several questions regarding this relationship between social media and media, more traditional media. So one of the questions says, news outlets have been demanding social media platforms to pay for their content. Do you agree with their demands? How should this be regulated? And another says, why is it more appropriate for social networks to be classified as technology companies than as media companies? Is it logical for technology companies such as Facebook, Twitter to deal with the distribution of news and their selection? To what extent does the market monopoly of social networks undermine the standards of a democratic society? Are social networks competent to address freedom of speech issues? Like a lot of questions here, but yeah, how do you comment on this relationship between media, between journalists and social networks? Some critics say that Facebook and Google stand between publishers and their content and determine how, and their audiences, and determine how and whether news content is seen. And there's also this concept of newsworthiness that they've used at times in content moderation, which also affects news organizations and journalists.
Yeah, I have to say this is less my expertise, so I don't want to answer the questions incorrectly. I think that the journalists here probably have more expertise on these specific questions than I do. But that said, I think that addressing the point about newsworthiness and addressing the role that these corporations play in determining what is newsworthy and what's important is really key. So the newsworthiness exemption is really interesting because it's basically these companies have decided, they've taken it upon themselves to decide what is or is not worthy of the news. And we've already seen that they have an extreme bias toward the US, toward what's important to people in the United States, and to a lesser degree, Europe. And so when they decide what is newsworthy, they're often doing that within their own rubric of what's important. And this obviously disadvantages the rest of the world. So like I said, the reason I'm not really an expert on this is that a lot of this conversation, at least where in the US, is focused on US media, and I'm not so interested in that. But I don't have the expertise to really look at this from a global perspective either. I just haven't been focused on journalism in my work. But that said, I do think that there is a huge concern with for-profit corporations, and especially US ones, deciding what is important for the world in terms of news. And one of the ways that I've seen this play out is actually kind of outside of social media, but in Google search. Google News search is really interesting in what it decides is or is not a media website. And it's almost impossible for, if you are a publication, it's almost impossible for you to make any changes to that, to get your site listed in that. And I think that that's just sort of emblematic of the problems that we're seeing with some of these new initiatives by companies. And then I think the one other part of that question that I wanted to address was whether it was important for platforms to be classified as media or technology companies, it doesn't really matter under US law. So the way that Section 230 frames them is online intermediaries, and therefore it's kind of a false binary whether they're tech companies or media companies, because they are online intermediaries. They host speech. So I think that we're kind of missing the point in the US when when politicians right now are talking about classifying them as media companies. That's almost misinformation of itself.
We have another question that focuses on a specific type of media. I'm reading these out for people who are following through stream. So hi, Vladimir here from podcast.rs. First of all, I would like to thank you for your win against the Personal Audio LLC. It means a lot to all of us podcasters and community media activists. I would like to know how you see recent announcement by Facebook and Twitter about introducing podcasts into their platforms. Is this something we should be careful about? I'm referring here to the fact that services like Spotify do not use RSS feed, but copy the audio file and control all the traffic and analytics. I believe these other companies will probably do the same, which can lead to numerous problems. How can we make sure that podcasting will continue to be public?
That's also a really great question. It's also a little bit outside of my expertise. So I should say, just for everyone, so you know, EFF, where I work, we have more than 90 people working there. And so all of us are kind of focused on specific areas. And thank you, because we did have that. It was a great win. But I'm not a lawyer and I don't work on our legal team. And I definitely don't work on this issue. So I don't want to misrepresent what my organization would say here. But so I will just, in brief, say that I think that the issue that you're talking about here is really around ownership and around intellectual property and what we have the right to do. And these companies, like Spotify, for example, I think many of you will be familiar with this, but Spotify does not pay artists very well. It's paying them less than a penny per play. And so we're seeing a move from what was a pretty positive environment for musicians and artists being able to, reach new audiences and publish things online in ways that they weren't able to before. I mean, you used to have to get a record deal, right? Or a radio show. And now anyone can create things, and that's absolutely wonderful. But these companies, again, just like with media, they're trying to capitalize on that. The primary way that they do that is by making sure that they own everything that you're doing. And so I don't have an answer on how we can make sure that podcasting will continue to be public. But I do have colleagues who would probably be happy to address that question. If you're interested, I'd be happy to put you in touch.
I hope that answers your question to a satisfying degree, Vladimir. I wanted to go back to the questions about how civil society and media outlets use social media. We heard during the presentation how certain content can just disappear. Maybe you will not be given a reason what happened, or it's really difficult to find out why something was taken down. How should civil society organizations and small media outlets use social media? What is the best way to kind of mitigate this dependency on certain social media platforms, not just in terms of traffic and engaging the audiences, which is important for activists, important for journalists, but also in terms of archiving their content? What would be your recommendations how to use social media in order to kind of avoid this total dependency on certain platforms and make sure that your content is still somewhere and can be found even if these takedowns or page deletions happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I didn't talk much about infrastructure. I probably don't have time to, but one of the most problematic things about the web right now is just the absolute centralization of ownership. So whether it's Amazon Web Services, which hosts the vast majority of the internet right now, or these social media platforms that are very centralized, we're basically entrusting our content with unaccountable companies that really just don't care whether your stuff stays online or goes. And most of the time, as we've said, they're more than happy to take things down if your government demands it. But at the same time, there's not easy solutions to this either, because many of us can't afford to run our own servers, which would be the best answer, of course, to host your own content. So because that's not possible, I think that the most important tactics that we need to rely on are making sure that we're not contributing to that centralization by keeping everything in one place. So for me, that's a few things. One is, if you're an advocacy organization, it's obviously, that it's very important to meet people where they are, and oftentimes where they are is on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And so, we're using these platforms because we want to reach general audiences, people who may not know about these issues, but we're still subject to the rules as well and to these problems. So distributing your content across social networks, I know it's difficult and time consuming, but it's also important. Submitting your sites to the Internet Archive or other archiving sites. And there's increasingly really cool archival tools coming out. Again, that's not totally my area of expertise, but it's worth looking into. There's so many new tools that are meant to archive content to ensure that they're not, that it doesn't disappear. Like one that I'm aware of that's very specific, there's this group called Syrian Archive that's making sure that all of the videos that have been coming out of documenting the war in Syria, that those are preserved. And so Syrian Archive works really hard to preserve content from YouTube. You can always, there's probably efforts in your region that do similar things, but those are great things to start. I'm sure that they would be happy to work with people to help them understand the methods that they use. And then, of course, we forget backups. Everything's in the cloud these days, but remembering we may not be able to afford a whole server or know how to run one, but we can certainly back things up on a hard drive. And that's something that I have to be reminded of as well with my own website. But if we want to make sure that things exist for the next generation, it's really important to make sure that we archive them in various ways. So I think that would be my answer.
Thank you. Yes, another thing that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask about was this kind of future of content moderation, the way things are done now, which is becoming increasingly apparent during the pandemic, when a lot of the human content moderators were kind of sent home, I guess, and bulk of it was done by algorithms, by automated means. What does this look like for non-major languages? What kind of accuracy and access can users from smaller markets expect now that things are done this way? And how do you think things will be done in the future? Whether this trend of automation will continue, or what are the ways that we can expect our content to be moderated?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So it's really bad, to be honest. And I'm just going to share a quote from someone who is one of the early Facebook policy architects. He was kind enough to talk to me for my book. It was really hard to get people to speak on the record. But basically what he said is that automation works well for classifiable content, but for most other things, it's a poor substitute for people, for humans. Basically, what he gave me the example, it's a little bit of a crude example, but he said, like, an image of, let's say, someone nude, a famous nude person. You might say, okay, this is a famous photo of a person who's nude, but a machine can't determine, who that person is, what the context of it is, because there's no context in the photo. You have to know other facts, you have to know history, and those problems are really hard. And it gets even harder when we're talking about actual text or speech, because there's nuance in what people say. And so, whereas with an image, you might be able to say, okay, these are grapes, right? Like, that's easy. These are grapes. Grapes are not allowed, so we'll put them in the not allowed pile. But then when it comes to something like, an image that is documentation of war, such as the famous terror of war image that was removed by Facebook a few years ago. That was a nude child, and yet it was a photo that had come out of the Vietnam War and was really important to our history. And so obviously, Facebook kind of changed their policy after that, but that's such a good example because it shows how, on the one hand, you don't want to allow nude children. On the other hand, a famous photo documenting war is really important. And so if we extrapolate that and think about that in terms of text and the nuance required to understand text, obviously, the smaller the language group, the harder it's going to be. And the reason for that is that that machine learning is trained on language sets, such as like United Nations documents or libraries of books. And so the bigger your language, the more data that's going to go into that system that's going to enable the algorithm to understand nuance in speech. Now, for English, it's pretty good. For French, it's probably pretty good. German, and then you get down to like the smaller languages in the world, and it's absolutely terrible. And so what we're seeing is, number one, that for smaller languages, there's actually less content being moderated in the first place. There's some languages that don't even seem to be covered at all by automated content moderation. I would guess that for the languages of your region, there's some, of course, but often it's very blunt. And so what we've seen, Facebook actually explained this. I won't pull up the page right now because it would take me a minute, but Facebook has actually said that when they're dealing with a conflict in a region where they don't have a lot of that automation in place, or where there's not a large catalog to train machines on, that they'll, if there's a word that's become controversial, then they will basically take that word and ban it in all circumstances. And so the negative impact of this is that you're going to see words that have both negative and positive meanings, or negative and neutral meanings. The word will entirely be erased. I don't have a very good example for that one that would be widely understood, but imagine, a word that is used as a slur against a certain group, but maybe also used by that group to describe themselves. This is a pretty common phenomenon. That's one example where this happens. And so it both protects people from hateful speech, but it also disempowers them in terms of self-reference. And so there's a lot of that kind of blunt automated moderation. And there's really just not, right now, these companies don't have any incentive to invest well in smaller languages, but they're also, as I mentioned, they're challenged by the fact that there aren't large libraries of information in those languages that machines have already been trained on. So it's really kind of a dual problem. And that's why I would be very wary of advocating for more automation, particularly in those smaller language sets, because, as you know, you do need kind of human nuance to understand it. And I understand, of course, that in your region, there's, nuance even between a kind of large language group, right? Between each of the different dialects, or I'm not sure if that's the right term, but so I think that that's another area where you would need not just humans, but humans from each of those places to understand the way that certain terms are used from country to country.
Yes,
even true of larger languages as well, like Spanish. Obviously, words are used differently in Spain than they are in, say, Chile. So if that helps understand.
Yes, and with those efforts to kind of automatically block certain words, certain phrases, extend to also having an online discussion about the use of the term. So if you wanted to just from a philosophical point of view, kind of, or linguistic point of view, have a discussion, that discussion would also be blocked.
Yes. Yeah. So there are words. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't call this a widely common practice, but I mean, as I said, Facebook's actually admitted to it. So I can't pull up any of the words immediately in my brain, but there are some terms that are just completely banned from being used at all because of the ways that they're used in hate speech. And so you wouldn't be able to have a conversation about that word. You would have to use substitutes for that word. This is also true of certain images. Obviously, like things like swastikas are just not allowed. And so when you do see a swastika get through, it's because somebody's found some way to get around the system, which we don't want with swastikas, of course, but with things like being able to talk about the use of a term. I think it is actually really important for free expression for people to be able to discuss words and talk about why they're so harmful rather than just have them completely blocked out. So I would argue that this is actually a really lazy method of content moderation.
Do you think the same would apply to using copyright as kind of the basis for recognizing certain content and removing it? Is this something that affects speech on the platforms the way that copyright is used for removal of content?
Yeah, so there's this thing called Content ID, which is basically, it's really similar to some of the automated practices used for speech. But basically, like it detects a song, and I can't explain this in a very technical way. I'm guessing there are some people like, oh, I know this better than she does, but Content ID basically identifies say a piece of music or a piece of sound against an existing database. And so it's a really, really imperfect technology. Some of the examples that we've seen, one of my favorite ones is there was something that someone uploaded a couple of years ago that was just like 5 minutes of white noise, just background noise. And Content ID mistakenly labeled that as something else and removed it. And so when you apply these automated practices to things like copyright, yes, I mean, there are advocates for this because there are people who don't want their things being used or being shared illegally, obviously, because they're not going to make profit from that. But then there's also the use case of total mistakes, like the one that I just gave. But then there's kind of this middle issue as well, which is around fair use. So in the US, there's a concept of fair use. It's probably true elsewhere. But basically that enables you as a creator to use snippets of things. This is how we've gotten things like hip hop and techno, because people take samples from existing music and utilize them in a way that sometimes you have to pay for, but if it's under a certain size, and again, I'm not an expert on the law here, but some of it is considered fair use. Same with comedy and parody, satire. Being able to take something and utilize it is not necessarily a violation of copyright. But automation, again, is a really blunt object that often ignores those other use cases. And so we do see violations of free expression there as well.
We have a few more questions. We have another just a little bit of time left. So Mario is saying, thank you for your useful and needed presentation, but also thanks to organizers for making this lecture happen. I would add one more question of my interest, if it does not go too far from the scope of your work and presentation, about EFF's community pursuing the legacy of Aaron Swartz, let's say pirate philosophy activism. And we have another question, more philosophical kind, I guess, saying, is the world without social media even imaginable anymore?
Those are both great questions. So Aaron Swartz, so that is it's a question around, I guess, pirate philosophy activism and copyright. Again, I don't work on those areas, so I'm not sure I can answer this one very well. I know that there's a lot of work being done here, but again, I'm in Germany and my colleagues that work on US things are in the US. So I'm competent in talking about the US, but I work mostly on issues related to the rest of the world, which makes it hard for me to answer this question well. I mean, that said, we're definitely still very engaged in those legal fights in the United States to ensure that activists like Aaron Swartz are not prosecuted for the things that they've done. I think that, yeah, there's a lot of effort by other groups. There's a great group in the US called Fight for the Future, which works on this. But yeah, I'm sorry that I can't answer that one in full. I wish I could. And the other question was, remind me, I don't see it.
Can you even imagine a future without social media?
I can't, and yet I want to. Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic has been really hard on all of us. And I think that for me, it's just demonstrated how difficult it is to extract ourselves from these things. And yet I feel like I'm seeing a lot of harm, not just the harms that we've talked about, like harassment and hate speech come from these platforms, but also just very insular, like circular discussions happening right now, especially around regulation, around what to do about social media. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of ideas come about that really ignore the history and ignore the background of things that we've seen. So in the US, I'm seeing a lot of people advocating for regulations that were already shot down 15 years ago, seeing people advocate for things like the fairness doctrine, which I believe would hamper free expression. And so I worry that social media is kind of damaging to us. And yet I'm also very aware of how reliant people are on it, not just for human connection right now. I don't know if anyone else is living alone at the moment, but I'm temporarily alone. My partner is traveling. And so it's really hard, right? It's hard to just be in your apartment all day and not be able to move around much. I don't know if any of you, are in that situation, but so yeah, it's hard for me right now to imagine the world without social media. And yet my hope is that by this time next year, we'll be able to think about these things differently, because we won't be so absolutely reliant on social media for information, for connection, and for organizing.
What a lovely sentiment to end on. Before we conclude, I was just thank you, Maya, for attending. Before we conclude, I wanted to ask for your final kind of advice and recommendation to us as regular users. What can we do to improve the way our content and freedom of expression is treated by social media platforms, and what incentives do these platforms have to listen to us anyway?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not completely hopeless about this. So, I think that we're in a frustrating time, but at the same time, it's really important for us to remember that these companies and our governments are often working hand in hand to make decisions for us that we don't get to have a say in. And so from my perspective, the most important thing that we can do right now, especially while we are at home, is link up, connect with people outside of our countries and our regions. I think that any solutions that happen, any good solutions, are going to come from people around the world collaborating together to find those solutions, which is why I'm wary, especially as a person from the US, as a white person, as somebody who's of relative privilege, of being the one to put forward solutions, because obviously there's always going to be some blind spot in my head. And so that's why it's so important to me that we operate in solidarity with one another, that we work with people and hear their point of view, because it's always going to be a little bit different from ours. And so the best solutions that we're going to come to are ones that, not to be too corny or trite, but that come from kind of the power of the people. Because again, our governments are often working together to create things for us that don't have us in mind. And these companies are working with our governments to do that. So it's important that we fight back against them.
Thank you for those inspiring words, Gillian. I would definitely leave it there. We don't have any more questions, and we are nearly out of time anyway. Thank you for this very interesting talk, this discussion about a very complex topic. I'm sure there are a lot more questions we could be asking, but yeah, as you said, we can all keep working together on solving them. Thank you all for being with us today. Thanks to our interpreters for working tirelessly behind the scenes. And meet us, I would like to invite you all to meet us again tomorrow at the same time, when we'll be discussing another very interesting topic for media literacy, science journalism. Our guest will be Milica Momčilović, president of World Federation of Science Journalists. So make sure to log on for that one as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.